DPU, delivered at place unloaded. It is a new rule for Incoterms 2020. Many people assume it to be merely a name change from DAT, delivered at terminal, but in fact, it is much more than that. A brief introduction to delivered at place unloaded, DPU. The DAT was introduced in 2010 as an extension of DEQ, delivered ex-key, to cover any mode of transport. DAT implied that the seller delivered the goods, unloaded, into a terminal, a container yard, an airport terminal, or a covered warehouse. Unfortunately, that explanation was not clear in the wording of DAT, although its position before DAP in the order of the 2010 rules seems to reinforce it. The difference between DPU and DAP now is that it includes places such as the buyer's premises, and thus is displayed after DAP. Can the delivery at place unloaded Incoterms 2020 rule work? Within the Central and Eastern European landmass, it is certainly possible. From a courier parcel delivery perspective, it represents what happens when the driver removes the parcel from the truck and offers it to the customer. Even smaller air freight parcels that a truck driver can lift are feasible. It remains to be seen what will happen in practice for air freight shipments and container shipments across oceans. Besides obtaining the appropriate paperwork from the buyer to take possession of the goods, from the airline or shipping line, it is the carrier's responsibility to arrange for the unloading of goods at the destination. In the case of goods shipped in containers, this may involve additional labor and a forklift, as well as pallet jacks. Moreover, labor and machinery not employed, or contracted by the buyer may create insurance issues, and workplace safety concerns. Delivered at place unloaded, sellers and buyers' obligations, costs, and risks. DPU, A1B1 General Obligations. A1 General Obligations, Seller. Each of the 11 rules requires that the seller deliver the goods, and their commercial invoice in line with the contract of sale, and any other documentation of conformity, such as an analysis certificate, or weighbridge document. Each of the rules stipulates that documents can be provided in paper or electronic form, under the contract, or customary in the contract's absence. Currently, the rules offer no guidance as to what constitutes an electronic form, which can range from a PDF file to a blockchain or some format, yet to be developed. B1 General Obligations, Buyer. According to each rule, the buyer must pay the price specified in the contract of sale. It does not specify when payment is due, before shipment, immediately after shipment, 30 days after shipment, half now, half later, etc., or how it is to be paid, prepayment, against a copy of the documents via email, via a letter of credit, or otherwise. These matters should be outlined in contracts. DPU, A2B2 Delivery. A2 Delivery, Seller. The DAP and DDP procedures require the seller to take almost all responsibility for putting the goods on the buyer's doorstep at the agreed destination, or within that location but not unloading them from the arriving conveyance. This will most likely be a truck or a train, but it might also be a barge or ship, or even a chartered aircraft, though this is unlikely. Moreover, when the DPU rule is applied, the seller must unload goods from the arriving transport. Instead of taking it literally as its title dictated, which could refer to any open space, covered warehouse, or buyer's warehouse, DPU has been expanded to encompass any location, not just a terminal, to avoid the misunderstandings created by the 2010 rule. In DAP and DDPs specifically, people make the opposite mistake of DAT, assuming that the destination is always the buyer's premises. This is often not true. The buyer can specify the location of a new factory they are building for their client, a container terminal in the destination country, or wherever else they like. The buyer's premises or their designated site would usually have the equipment to unload the goods. Still, sometimes trucks will have cranes attached to them, or even forklifts, or the goods may be so specialized that the seller would also be required to provide the equipment to unload them. It is common for the seller's carrier to unload the means of transportation at the destination, such as the container from the truck that brought it from the dock, or goods from the chartered aircraft, for instance, making it a DPU rather than DAP. The goods must be delivered by the agreed date or within the specified period. B2 Delivery, Buyer. The buyer has an obligation to accept delivery of the goods when delivered, as described in the A2 article on delivery. DPU, A3B3 Transfer of risk. A3 Transfer of risk, Seller. Under normal circumstances, the seller is responsible for any loss or damage to goods, until they have been delivered as described in the A2 article on delivery. An exception to this is damage to or loss of goods resulting from the circumstances, described in the B3 article on transfer of risks, where the buyer's role in the B2 article on delivery differs. B3 Transfer of risk, Buyer. The moment the goods reach the buyer, the risk of loss or damage passes to the buyer. If the buyer does not inform the seller where the goods are to be delivered, or fails to do import clearance of the goods, the buyer is liable for any loss or damage to the goods after the agreed delivery date. When the seller ships the goods to the buyer, but the buyer did not get the import permit promptly, those goods are impounded indefinitely by the importing country's authorities. The risk belongs to the buyer. DPU, A4/B4 Carriage. A4 Carriage, Seller. In addition, the seller must arrange for transportation to the named place of destination, and within that destination, if an agreed destination point has been established. The seller is responsible for the cost of this carriage. For the seller to arrange transportation, it must receive information from the buyer about the goods delivery address. If the destination is indicated as Budapest, Hungary, on which street in Budapest are the goods to be left? The exact location could be at the buyer's premises, or an empty building site, the carrier's facilities, the airport, or a container yard, or on a quay on a river. It would be best to determine the exact location ahead of time. Otherwise, it is at the seller's discretion to choose the location that best meets the purpose of the sale, which is usually the cheapest option, such as a cargo terminal. Any security requirements for transportation to the destination are the seller's responsibility. B4 Carriage, Buyer. The buyer is not obligated to arrange a carriage contract with the seller. DPU, A5B5 Insurance. A5 Insurance, Seller. The seller is not required to insure the goods, even though they have the risk of loss or damage until delivery. B5 Insurance, Buyer. As the seller bears the risk of loss or damage to the goods until the point of delivery, the buyer is not under any obligation to purchase insurance. DPU, A6B6 Delivery, Transport Document. A6 Delivery, Transport Document, Seller. The seller's responsibility is to provide any documents. The buyer needs to take possession of the goods at its own expense. A receipt signed by the buyer will probably be the form of the document, and will depend on the contract arrangements. When the buyer must import clear the goods, under a DAP or DPU, the seller must provide a copy of the transport document. B6 Delivery, Transport Document, Buyer. The buyer's responsibility is to accept the document included in the A6 article on delivery, since it does not affect the transport process in any way. DPU, A7B7 Export, Import Clearance. A7 Export, Import Clearance, Seller. During the export process, the seller is responsible for completing all the formalities required for export clearance by the country of export, such as licensing or permits, security clearance for export, pre-shipment inspections, and any other authorizations or approvals required by the country of export. Additionally, because delivery in these rules occurs in the country of import, the seller must also arrange and fulfill any formalities required by the country of transit before the delivery happens. It is not the seller's responsibility to arrange any import clearances. However, the seller must assist the buyer in obtaining any documents or information needed to attend to import requirements, such as permits, licenses, security clearance for import, pre-shipment inspection requirements of the import authorities, and any other licenses or approvals. B7 Export, Import Clearance, Buyer. At the seller's request, risk, and cost, the buyer will assist in obtaining all export-related documents or information needed for all formalities required by the country of export as well as those required by every transit country. The buyer is responsible for completing and paying all formalities required by the importing country. These include the licenses and permits needed to import, import clearance, security clearances for transit and import, inspections before shipment, and any other authorizations or conditions required for import. DPU, A8B8 checking, packaging, marking. A8 checking, packaging, marking, seller. Under all rules, the seller is expected to pay the costs for any inspection operations required for delivering the goods, including examining the quality, measuring the goods or packaging, weighing, counting the goods and packaging. Packaging of the goods is both the seller's responsibility and the seller's cost unless the goods are typically sold unpackaged, like bulk goods. Sellers must also consider the transport of the goods and package them appropriately, unless they have agreed in their contract to package, or mark the goods in a particular way. B8 checking, packaging, marking, buyer. Under all rules, the buyer has no responsibility for marking or packaging. In practice, though, a few exceptions exist, such as when a buyer provides a seller with labels, logos, or something similar. DPU, A9B9 Allocation of Costs. A9 Allocation of Costs, Seller. Sellers are responsible for all delivery costs until goods are delivered, except those that the buyer must pay according to the B9 article on the allocation of costs. Sellers must bear all transportation costs incurred due to a contract of carriage, including the costs of loading goods, and any transport-related security. Proof of the delivered goods is also the responsibility of the seller. If the carriage contract includes unloading at the agreed destination, the seller is responsible for paying these charges. The seller must cover any costs associated with providing proof that the goods have been delivered. All export clearance costs, export duties, and taxes, where applicable, are the seller's responsibility. The seller's responsibility is to reimburse the buyer for any paperwork or information the buyer provides to assist them in their export formalities, or arrange insurance. Unlike DAP, DPU is characterized by the seller paying for the unloading of the goods. B9 Allocation of Costs, Buyer. Once the goods are delivered, the buyer is responsible for all costs associated with them, except those that are the seller's responsibility. The buyer must reimburse the seller's costs, if the seller assists the buyer in obtaining information, or documents needed for import formalities. Duties, taxes, and other import clearance costs are the buyer's responsibility. When the seller advises that goods are ready and indicates that they are related to the contract, in that case, the buyer must also pay any additional costs incurred due to failure to give notice under B10. DPU, A10 B10 Notices. A10 Notices, Seller. The seller must notify the buyer as soon as the goods have been shipped. B10 Notices, Buyer. A buyer must notify the seller in writing about the time and location they require delivery under the contract. Typically, the contract will specify how much notice must be given, and this will depend on the type and mode of transport. Recap. The seller is responsible for arranging the carriage and unloading the goods from the arriving means of transportation, and delivering them to the named location. Once the goods have been unloaded, the risk transfers from the seller to the buyer. This is the only rule that requires the seller to unload the goods as part of the delivery process. The buyer is responsible for ensuring that imports are cleared and for paying any local taxes or duties. Thank you for watching, and I hope the information provided in this video gives you a better understanding of the Incoterms rule for DPU. Do drop me your comments and let me know your thoughts. Coming soon, DDP, Delivered Duty Paid. To be the first to watch the next video, please subscribe to my channel and click on the notification bell. Goodbye. From your trusted shipping guide. Revisit.